where history became rubble. These are the stories behind 15 of the most iconic locations from cinema history. Sets, buildings, and neighborhoods that appeared on screen to define entire genres and generations, then were demolished, burned, flooded, condemned, or simply forgotten. From a Depression-era shantytown that Chaplin turned into art before bulldozers erased it, to the original Disneyland adjacent backlot where science fiction was born, to the New York tenement block that housed a dozen classic films before urban renewal swallowed it whole. These are the places where movie magic happened once, and only once, because the locations themselves no longer exist. The brownstones at 72 Bedford Street in Greenwich Village was not a real apartment building. It was a painted flat, a false front constructed for exterior shots in the 1994 romantic comedy Friends, which used for the iconic establishing shots of Monica and Rachel's building that opened nearly every episode for 10 years. The actual building at that address exists and has always existed, occupied by real tenants who have spent 3 decades answering the door to tourists from Ohio and Japan and Brazil who want to photograph the purple door that was never actually purple on that building. What disappeared was the fiction, the constructed idea of that building as a place where those people lived. The production design that made it iconic existed only on a Warner Brothers soundstage in Burbank, California, and that set was struck in 2004 when the series ended. The Central Perk set, the apartment interiors, the hallway, all gone. A replica Central Perk pop-up opened in New York briefly in 2014 for the show's 20th anniversary, and drew lines around the block for a month before disappearing again. What remains is only a real building that millions of people have convinced themselves is a fictional one. The Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis, Missouri appeared in no famous film before it disappeared. And that is precisely the point. It was demolished so spectacularly, so photographically, that the demolition itself became one of the most reproduced images of the 20th century. 33 identical 11-story towers, built between 1954 and 1956 as a modernist utopia for 15,000 residents, were detonated in stages beginning in 1972 after becoming uninhabitable through a combination of policy failure, funding cuts, and deliberate neglect. The footage of the towers falling appeared in Godfrey Reggio's 1982 experimental film Koyaanisqatsi, used as evidence of a civilization destroying itself. Architect Minoru Yamasaki designed both Pruitt-Igoe and the original World Trade Center towers. The demolition footage became so iconic that architecture theorist Charles Jenks declared the moment of the first detonation, July 15, 1972, at 3:32 p.m., as the precise death of modernist architecture. The 57-acre site sat largely vacant for decades, eventually becoming a forest. Urban succession reclaiming the geometry. A documentary in 2011 finally gave the complex the full reckoning it deserved. But the buildings themselves were gone 40 years before anyone thought to mourn them properly. The original Haunted Mansion, not the Disney attraction, but the crumbling Victorian estate at 1798 Orleans Avenue in New Orleans that served as the primary exterior location for the 1974 blaxploitation horror film Sugar Hill, was demolished in 1998 during a neighborhood redevelopment sweep. The production had chosen it specifically because it looked genuinely abandoned and genuinely threatening. A 3-story house with collapsing galleries and Spanish moss hanging from every surface. The film used it as the home of a voodoo queen, extracting revenge on the gangsters who murdered her boyfriend. And the building needed no art direction to suggest menace. It had been built in 1859, survived the Civil War, survived Reconstruction, survived a century of New Orleans humidity, and was then removed in roughly 2 weeks by a demolition crew that had no idea what they were taking down. The site is now a parking lot for a medical facility. No plaque, no marker, no acknowledgement. Horror fans who have tried to find the location arrive at empty asphalt and a chain link fence and must reconstruct geography entirely from freeze frames. The Appia Antica backlot of Cinecittà Studios in Rome contained, at its peak in the 1950s and 1960s, the largest outdoor film set ever constructed on the European continent. Ancient Rome was built there, literally. The forums, the colonnaded streets, the slave quarters and chariot paths used in Ben-Hur, Spartacus, and Fellini's Roman sequences were constructed at a scale that required its own internal road system. After decades of use, the outdoor sets began deteriorating through the 1980s and were gradually dismantled, partially burned in a 1984 fire that destroyed several irreplaceable structures, and eventually cleared to make room for expanded studio facilities and, later, a theme park component. The interior sound stages at Cinecittà are still operational and still used for major productions, but the ancient world that existed outdoors, the functional Rome that filmmakers walked through and lit and populated, is gone entirely. Photographs from the 1960s show something that looks less like a movie set and more like an actual archaeological site, which is perhaps why its loss registers so quietly. It looked like it had already been lost once before. The Bradbury Building in downtown Los Angeles did not disappear. It still stands on South Broadway and is one of the most photographed interiors in the city. What disappeared was the version of it that appeared in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner in 1982. The grimy, rain-slicked, vertically decaying shell that Scott's production design team transformed into the Sebastian apartment building of a dystopian 2019. The production aged the building deliberately, added false signage, ran pipes across the skylight court, and buried its ornate Victorian ironwork under layers of artificial grime and smoke. That version, that specific, beautiful, dying version of the building, exists only in the film. The real Bradbury was subsequently restored to immaculate condition, its ironwork polished, its skylight gleaming. It is now a registered historic landmark, and its main court is rented for private events and film productions that want its beauty rather than its decay. Visitors who arrive expecting to find Deckard's world discover instead something almost optimistic, a building that outlasted the dystopia that was projected onto it, stubbornly clean in the California sunlight. The Clunes Auditorium in downtown Los Angeles, a 2,500-seat venue where D.W. Griffith premiered The Birth of a Nation in 1915, was demolished in 1960 to make way for a parking structure. The premiere itself was one of the most consequential events in American film's history. President Woodrow Wilson reportedly screened it privately at the White House. The Knox Pop organized protests that failed to stop its distribution, and the film's explicit glorification of the Ku Klux Klan contributed directly to the Klan's revival as a national organization. The building where all of that began was considered unremarkable enough to demolish 45 years later without significant public debate. The parking structure that replaced it was itself demolished in the 1990s. The site currently holds a modern office building. The chain of erasure is so complete that it requires real archival effort to establish that anything of significance ever occupied that particular corner of downtown Los Angeles. And the significance, in this case, is one of the most troubling chapters in cinema's relationship with American racism. The original Munchkinland exterior from The Wizard of Oz, the physical set constructed on Stage 27 at MGM's Culver City Studios in 1938, was struck immediately after principal photography wrapped and the materials were dispersed. The yellow brick road, the Munchkin village, the practical flowers and trees that surrounded Dorothy's arrival in Oz. All of it was a temporary construction that was disassembled as routinely as any set. The lumber cataloged into studio inventory, the yellow bricks stored or thrown away. MGM's Culver City studio was subsequently sold again, partially demolished, and the surviving stages were converted into production facilities for other companies. Stage 27, where Oz was largely built, still exists within what is now the Sony Pictures Studio lot, but it is an empty stage. The specific geography of a place that has existed in the imagination of hundreds of millions of people for nearly 90 years was built in approximately 3 months, used for approximately 3 months, and has not existed in any physical form since. The experience of returning to Kansas and returning to Oz takes place entirely in a building that now houses other people's other fictions. The Hotel Cecil in downtown Los Angeles, where several scenes from low-budget horror productions of the 1980s were filmed, and which served as the real-world backdrop for the Elisa Lam disappearance that Netflix later dramatized in Crime Scene. The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel was converted into affordable housing in 2021 after a lengthy renovation. The original Cecil, the version that had accumulated decades of grim history across its 700 rooms, where the carpet and furnishings and operational logic of a flophouse horror had calcified into something almost deliberately cinematic, was gutted. The renovation preserved the exterior and the lobby's Art Deco bones, but the interior, that filmmakers had used precisely because it felt genuinely threatening, genuinely decayed, genuinely wrong in a way that no production design could fully replicate, was stripped back to the studs. It is now called Stay on Main in its affordable housing configuration. The transformation is arguably a better outcome for the people who need housing in downtown Los Angeles. But the building that existed as a real-world horror location, the one that functioned simultaneously as cinema set and actual nightmare, is gone even though the address remains. The entirety of the Rainier Mesa location in Nevada, where Stan Kubrick's second unit team filmed exterior desert sequences for Spartacus in 1960, was later incorporated into the Nevada test site and subsequently restricted from civilian access for decades due to nuclear testing proximity. The specific arroyos and ridgelines that appeared on screen are inaccessible to the general public and have been since the early 1960s. This represents a unique category of cinematic location loss, not demolished, not redeveloped, but sealed off by the federal government behind restricted access zones. The landscape still exists physically, but has been removed from the accessible world as effectively as if it had been paved over. Historians researching the production to reconstruction entirely from call sheets and aerial photographs because ground-level access simply cannot happen. There is something deeply Kubrickian about the fact that land used for one of the great films about human freedom was subsequently made inaccessible by the nuclear security apparatus of the same government that claimed to defend that freedom. The Millennium Dome in Greenwich, London, built for the year 2000 celebrations at a cost of £789 million and used as the primary action set for the James Bond film The World Is Not Enough in 1999, was not demolished, but instead became something arguably stranger. It was repurposed as an entertainment venue called the O2, wrapped in corporate sponsorship branding, and converted into one of the most successful concert venues in the world. The specific interior spaces used in the Bond film, the enormous central tent, the access corridors, the mechanical infrastructure, are entirely unrecognizable within the current venue configuration. The dome that Bond slides across no longer exists as a coherent space. What replaced it seats 20,000 people for concerts by artists who have no connection to 1960s British spy mythology. This is not demolition but transformation, so complete it functions as erasure. The building persists, but the place is gone, repainted and recarpeted and rebranded into something that shares only its address and its distinctive outline with the location where a scene was filmed 25 years ago. The Rivoli Theatre on Broadway at 49th Street in New York City, which hosted the world premiere of King Kong on March 2, 1933, an event so sensational that the audience reportedly refused to leave after the first screening and stayed for a second consecutive showing, was demolished in 1991 to make way for a skyscraper. The premiere itself was one of the great spectacles of Hollywood's golden age. RKO mounted a massive publicity campaign. The Depression-era audience encountered stop-motion animation at a scale and quality they had genuinely never seen, and the screening was by most accounts something close to a collective religious experience. The theater that housed that moment was a 2,042-seat Baroque Revival Palace built in 1917, redesigned in the Art Deco period, and considered architecturally significant by preservationists who nevertheless failed to stop its demolition. The building that replaced it houses offices. The premiere of King Kong, an event that could be argued as the single most genuinely astonishing first public screening in film history, took place in a building that has been offices for 30 years. The original Grauman's Chinese Theater forecourt, not the current structure, which still stands and is famous for its celebrity handprints and footprints in cement. But the specific forecourt configuration used in Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard in 1950, where an aged Norma Desmond imagines the cameras returning for her, was altered beyond recognition in a 1973 renovation that extended the lobby and reconfigured the entrance geometry. The specific angle from which Wilder filmed, the precise spatial relationship between the forecourt and the street that gave Norma Desmond's delusion its particular geography, no longer exists. The theater itself stands, the famous prints remain, and tourists continue to photograph themselves, matching their hands to the impressions of dead stars. But the version of the space that Wilder used to explore the machinery of obsolescence was itself made obsolete by renovation. There is a particular melancholy in this. The location used to examine what Hollywood discards was itself discarded by Hollywood, its geometry adjusted for better foot traffic flow. The entirety of the New York street set at the old Republic Pictures lot in the San Fernando Valley. A full block-length construction of brownstones, fire escapes, corner groceries, and period storefronts that was used as background dressing, crime films and gangster pictures throughout the 1940s, was demolished when Republic was sold and the lot redeveloped in the 1960s. The set had been so frequently used, redressed, repainted, and relit by different productions that it had accumulated a kind of architectural history of its own, the same corner appearing as 1930s Chicago in one film, 1940s Brooklyn in another, a fictional Midwest city in a third. It was a generic space that had been made specific so many times that it had developed a genuine character. Its loss is largely unrecorded because no single famous film claimed it as its own. It belonged to dozens of productions equally, and when it was gone, none of them had standing to mourn it. The lot is now a residential neighborhood, and residents occasionally find pieces of the brick facing in their gardens. The Vasquez Rocks in Agua Dulce, California, used in the original Star Trek television series as the alien planet setting for the fight between Kirk and the Gorn in Arena in 1967, still exist and are accessible as a Los Angeles County Natural Area Park. They did not disappear. What disappeared is almost more poignant. The specific staging, the precise camera angles, the practical lens filtration and lighting ratios that Shatner and the production crew established on those rocks in 1967 have been so thoroughly replicated, homaged, parodied, and referenced in subsequent productions that the real location now reads as a copy of its own representation. Visitors arriving at the actual rocks report a dissonance. The rocks are right there, exactly as they appeared, but the experience of seeing them in persons feels somehow less real than watching the television episode. The rocks that made a California desert look like an alien world now look like an alien world that is trying to be a California desert. The location persists, but has been hollowed out by the weight of its own iconography. The Variety Arts Center at 940 South Figueroa Street in Los Angeles, a 1924 Beaux-Arts building that served as the filming location for the tango scene in True Lies, for sequences in The Mask of Zorro, and most significantly, as the fictional Hotel Cortez exterior in the 5th season of American Horror Story, was closed to the public in 2015 and has been in a state of suspended redevelopment ever since, neither operating nor demolished, locked and deteriorating behind a preservation dispute between the building's owners and the Los Angeles Conservancy. It is a location that has effectively disappeared without being destroyed. Inaccessible, unmaintained, visible from the street but unreachable, haunted in the most literal possible sense by productions that used its grandeur and then left it to rot. Urban explorers who have documented the interior in recent years report that the ballroom's plasterwork is crumbling, the stage rigging is rusting, and the building is being reclaimed by pigeons and water damage in approximately equal measure. It is the only location on this list that is disappearing in real time. Slowly, without announcement, behind a chain-link fence on a block that most Angelenos pass without noticing.